The city of San Francisco stretched out beneath the glass walls of the Sterling Tower, a glimmering monument of steel and ambition that bore the name of a man who had built it from nothing but resolve, sleepless nights, and the restless ache of someone who never truly belonged anywhere. Adrian Vale, at 37, was the kind of man who made people lower their voices when he entered a room. His presence wasn't loud. It was deliberate, quiet, and disciplined. He had the calm precision of a man who had learned that silence carried more weight than most speeches. From the corner office on the top floor, he could see the entire skyline. The silver line of the Bay Bridge glowing under the sun, the slow dance of sailboats moving like white brushstrokes across the blue. Yet, for all its beauty, the view reminded him of something he didn't like to admit: how lonely success could become when there was no one left to share it with. He had built Vale Dynamics out of pure willpower, turning an obscure cybersecurity startup into one of the most powerful firms in the tech industry. His boardrooms were filled with Ivy League strategists and investors who measured loyalty in percentages and trust in NDAs. He was the youngest CEO to ever be featured on the cover of Global Business Weekly, but behind the sharp suits and the polished interviews was a man who had forgotten what laughter sounded like when it wasn't rehearsed. To the world, Adrian Vale was the embodiment of discipline and success. To himself, he was simply a man who couldn't remember the last time he had gone home before midnight, or woken up without a calendar full of obligations waiting to devour his hours. At exactly 8 a.m., a soft knock echoed against the glass door of his office. He didn't turn immediately. He knew the rhythm of that knock by heart. It was gentle but firm, respectful but confident. That was Clara Bennett, his executive assistant. She had been with him for 4 years, the longest anyone had lasted in that position. Most couldn't keep up with his relentless standards, his near-military scheduling precision, and his quiet intolerance for carelessness. But Clara had a way of anticipating what needed to be done before he even voiced it. She never sought attention, never used flattery, and never made excuses. There was something old-fashioned in her professionalism, and something quietly extraordinary about the steadiness she brought into his chaotic world. "Good morning, Mr. Vale," she said, stepping into the room with her usual grace. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who knew her worth but didn't need to announce it. She set a black folder on his desk, his daily brief perfectly prepared as always. "The quarterly review presentation is ready, and the team from Tokyo has confirmed the merger call for 9:30. Your lunch meeting with the investors is at 1, and the foundation gala invitation arrived this morning." She paused for a moment, hesitating before adding softly, "It's addressed to you with a +1. Adrian looked up from the screen, his steel gray eyes focusing on her. "The foundation gala?" he asked, leaning back slightly in his chair. "That's the one for the Horizon Children's Fund, isn't it?" Clara nodded. "Yes, sir. It's this Saturday evening at the Grand Marquette Hotel. It's the biggest event of the year for them, and for most of your peers, I imagine." He gave a faint, ironic smile. "My peers," he murmured. "People who spend more time pretending to care about causes than actually doing anything for them." His gaze drifted back to the window, to the endless city below. Then he added quietly, "Still, appearances matter." There was a long pause. Clara waited, sensing there was something else beneath his measured tone. He finally turned to her again. "Clara, I need you to come with me that night." The words seemed to surprise even him as they left his mouth. He wasn't the type to make impulsive decisions, least of all ones that blurred the lines of professionalism. But as soon as he said it, he knew it felt right, not as a romantic gesture, but as an act of trust. He needed someone at that event who wasn't there to use his name, charm investors, or play politics. He needed someone genuine, someone who could remind him of what decency still looked like. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "You'd like me to attend?" "With you?" Her tone wasn't doubtful, just careful. "Yes." He stood and crossed the room, hands in his pockets. "I'm expected to bring someone, and frankly, I can't imagine spending another one of those nights surrounded by insincerity. I'd rather have someone there who actually understands the work we do and why it matters." Clara hesitated, her professionalism warring with disbelief. "Mr. Vale, I appreciate the thought, but wouldn't that seem unconventional? Your friends, your business associates surely expect someone from your social circle." Adrian gave a faint, almost humorless chuckle. "My social circle," he repeated as if the words themselves were an inside joke. You mean the people who measure their friendships in profits? The ones who care more about being seen at the right table than actually believing in what they're funding? He paused, his voice softening. No, Clara, I've had enough of that. I need authenticity this time. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. I'll think about it, she said finally, and excused herself with quiet composure. When she left, Adrian found himself standing in the middle of his office, staring at the closed door. For a man used to controlling every variable of his life, he couldn't explain why this decision felt different, why inviting his assistant to a gala suddenly felt like the first honest thing he had done in years. That evening, while the rest of the office emptied, Clara stayed behind at her desk, the hum of city lights flickering against the glass walls. The invitation lay beside her keyboard, white card, gold lettering, elegant and intimidating. The Horizon Foundation Charity Gala was the kind of event she had only seen in magazines. A ballroom filled with politicians, venture capitalists, heirs and heiresses wearing names that whispered wealth. Her mother had once said, "Money doesn't just change how people live. It changes how they look at you." Clara had learned that truth early in life, growing up in a small town where her family's modest means made her invisible to those who mattered. She wasn't naive. She knew that if she attended, people would talk. They'd wonder why the most powerful man in the company brought his assistant, instead of one of the polished socialites who hovered in his orbit. But she also knew something else. Adrian Vale had never been a man driven by gossip. He moved according to his own principles, and that quiet defiance was one of the reasons she respected him so deeply. As she packed her things, her phone buzzed, a text from her younger brother Luke, who was still in college and often relied on her support. "Hey sis, you okay? Haven't heard from you in a few days." She smiled faintly, replying, "I'm fine. Long week. Might have to go to a fancy event this weekend for work." A few seconds later, his response came. "Fancy? Like tuxedos and champagne? You'll be amazing. You always are." She stared at the message longer than she meant to. It reminded her that sometimes life offered you chances not to fit in, but to stand out. The next morning, Adrian met his old friends at their usual club in Pacific Heights. They had known each other since university, though friends was a generous word for men who had long since drifted into different worlds. Marcus Gray, heir to a chain of luxury hotels, was lounging in a white polo, sipping espresso as if time itself moved slower for him. Beside him was Ethan Brooks, an investor whose laughter was as sharp as his criticism. "So," Marcus said, tossing his tennis racket onto the bench, "you're finally going to the Horizon Gala this year? I heard Catherine Blackwell has been dying to see you again. Her father practically runs half the Pacific Northwest real estate scene. You could do worse." Adrian wiped his hands with a towel. "Catherine's fine, but I'm not going with her." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, then who's the lucky one this time?" "My assistant," Adrian said simply, watching their expressions change. Marcus choked on his coffee. "Your assistant?" "Adrian, be serious." "I am." Ethan laughed, incredulous. "You can't be planning to show up with your employee to the most exclusive gala in the city. You'll look like you've lost your mind. Or worse, like you're trying to make a statement." "Maybe I am," Adrian replied calmly. "I'd rather spend an evening with someone I actually respect than waste time entertaining hollow conversations." Marcus shook his head. "You always did enjoy playing the martyr, but this isn't rebellion, it's career suicide. These people notice everything, from your cufflinks to your company." Adrian's expression didn't change. "Let them notice," he said quietly. "I'm done pretending to be impressed by people who mistake privilege for character." Ethan leaned forward, smirking. "Well, don't say we didn't warn you, just be ready for the whispers." Adrian finished his drink in silence, the faintest trace of irritation crossing his face. He had heard whispers his entire life, from the investors who doubted him, the press who speculated about his past, the critics who said he was too young, too unrelenting, too detached. But none of them had ever built what he had built. None of them had carried that loneliness. By Friday, the office buzzed with gossip. It wasn't official, but news traveled fast in high-rise towers. The CEO was bringing his assistant to the gala. Clara heard the murmurs in the hallways, the quick glances when she passed by. She ignored, them all focusing on work. But in the quiet of her mind, doubt lingered. What if Marcus and Ethan were right? What if this entire evening turned into a spectacle she wasn't ready for? That night, she went home and sat at her small dining table, the invitation still unopened beside her. Her mother's voice echoed, in her memory, "Confidence doesn't come from what you wear, Clara. It comes from remembering who you are." She took a deep breath, picked up the card, and decided she would go, not to impress anyone, not even Adrian, but because sometimes courage meant walking into rooms where no one expected you to belong. Saturday evening arrived under a sky the color of silver smoke. The Grand Marquette shimmered with chandeliers and marble floors, a place built for elegance and envy. Black cars lined the street outside, each one releasing a vision of satin gowns and tailored suits into the cold air. Inside the grand hall, the orchestra played a gentle waltz and conversations buzzed like champagne bubbles. Adrian arrived in a sleek black tuxedo, his presence commanding but effortless. For once, he wasn't thinking about mergers or algorithms. He was wondering whether Clara would actually come. He had given her the choice freely. If she didn't show, he wouldn't blame her. But part of him, an unfamiliar human part, hoped she would. And then, just as the first notes of the next song began, the doors opened. Clara stepped in. The room seemed to inhale. Conversations faltered. Even the orchestra softened. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the kind of color that caught the light and whispered sophistication without shouting for attention. Her hair was gathered into a graceful updo, soft, tendrils framing her face, and the pearl earrings she wore glowed subtly under the chandeliers. There was no designer label on that dress, but it carried something far rarer: heritage, memory, and grace. For a moment, Adrian forgot how to breathe. He had seen her every day for 4 years, but tonight, she was someone else entirely. Not because of the dress, but because of the quiet confidence that radiated from her. She wasn't pretending to belong. She simply did. He walked forward, offering his arm. "You look." His voice caught slightly, then steadied. "Incredible." Clara smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Vale. You clean up pretty well yourself." He chuckled softly, and together they walked into the crowd. Heads turned, whispers began. Marcus and Ethan were among the first to notice, their smirks fading into silence as they saw her. Catherine Blackwell, standing near the champagne bar, lowered her glass with a flicker of surprise that bordered on resentment, but Adrian didn't see them. For the first time in years, he didn't care what anyone thought. That night wasn't about status or appearances. It was about something deeper, a quiet moment of defiance wrapped in grace. And as they stepped into the golden light of the ballroom, Adrian realized something he hadn't in a long time. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The moment Adrian and Clara stepped into the ballroom, the air changed. Not in an obvious way, but in the subtle shifts of conversation, the faint pause of champagne flutes halfway to lips, the quick glances over shoulders, the restrained smiles that flickered like hidden sparks of curiosity. The Horizon Foundation Gala was, after all, not just a charity event. It was a display of power, taste, and silent rivalry wrapped in music and glitter. The orchestra's melody floated through the chandeliers like silk, but underneath the polished harmony of violins and piano, there pulsed something colder, the hum of judgment that always lingered in rooms where money and reputation met. Adrian had attended this event for the past 6 years, but never once had he felt as aware of the room as he did tonight. Normally, he moved through these gatherings like a machine, smiling when required, shaking hands with senators, memorizing faces and names for future leverage. But tonight, as he walked with Clara at his side, everything felt different. The usual monotony was replaced by something unfamiliar and alive. Perhaps it was because for once he wasn't pretending. For once he had chosen sincerity over strategy. Clara, meanwhile, felt her heart pounding beneath the silk of her midnight blue gown, but she refused to let it show. Years of professionalism had trained her expression into composure, yet tonight demanded more than just control. It required courage. Every eye in the room seemed to follow her, measuring, comparing, calculating. She knew what they saw. Not a polished socialite or a trophy on a billionaire's arm, but a woman who had climbed her way into this world through merit and persistence. She stood beside one of the most powerful men in the city, and though whispers rippled through the crowd, she met them with quiet dignity. She had grown up learning that self-worth wasn't granted by approval. It was claimed through authenticity. Adrian guided her toward the reception area, where the city's elite mingled beneath gold-draped arches and crystal chandeliers. He could already hear Marcus's voice, a low, mocking tone disguised as casual conversation. "Adrian, my friend." Marcus greeted, flashing that same too-perfect smile that had always irritated him. "And you must be." He hesitated deliberately, eyes flicking over Clara's gown, his curiosity poorly masked behind politeness. "The assistant we've heard so much about." "Clara Bennett," Adrian said evenly, his tone sharp enough to discourage any insult. "She manages more of my company than half the board does." Clara extended her hand with poise. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Gray." Marcus recovered quickly, offering a handshake that was more performance than greeting. "Likewise," he said, but the flicker of disbelief in his eyes betrayed his words. Ethan, standing nearby with his glass of whiskey, smirked. "Well, I must say, Adrian, you never cease to surprise. Bringing your assistant to the grandest ball of the year, now that's what I call innovation." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. He could have dismissed it with a cold remark, but instead, he glanced at Clara, who simply smiled, calm, composed, unshaken. "Innovation," she said softly, meeting Ethan's gaze without flinching, "is about doing something no one else has the courage to attempt." The remark landed with such quiet confidence that Ethan was momentarily silenced, and Marcus forced a laugh that sounded unsteady. Adrian said nothing, but the faintest trace of admiration crossed his features. She didn't need him to defend her. She could handle herself just fine. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow waltz of politics and pretense. Waiters glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne, and the orchestra's melody swelled through the marbled hall. Guests exchanged stories of profits, disguised as charity, their laughter as polished as their cufflinks. Adrian moved among them with practiced ease, but his attention rarely left Clara. He watched how she listened, truly listened, when philanthropists spoke about the Foundation's mission, how she asked insightful questions about their outreach programs instead of indulging in small talk about art auctions and European vacations. People noticed her sincerity, even if they didn't know how to respond to it. In a room accustomed to superficial charm, authenticity had become the rarest currency of all. By the time dinner was served, Clara had begun to relax into the rhythm of the evening. She sat beside Adrian at the head table, surrounded by CEOs, investors, and politicians whose conversations often blurred into self-congratulation. The 7-course meal glittered with extravagance, caviar, truffle risotto, and wine older than she was, but she barely noticed. What struck her more than the luxury was the emptiness of it all. These were people who spoke of generosity, yet treated empathy like a networking tool. And yet she saw something in Adrian tonight. A flicker of restlessness behind his calm demeanor, a subtle distance in his eyes whenever the conversation drifted toward hollow praise. It made her wonder how long he had been living like this, surrounded by people who admired his success but never really saw him. During the speeches, the founder of the Horizon Foundation, an elderly woman named Margaret Hollis, took the stage. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had dedicated her life to service, not profit. She spoke about the Foundation's mission, to fund hospitals, build schools, and provide opportunities for children from struggling communities. As she spoke, Clara noticed Adrian's expression soften. For the first time that night, he looked moved, not by performance but by purpose. When applause filled the room, he leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "That's why I support this cause. My mother was a nurse. She used to volunteer at a small clinic like that." Clara turned to him surprised. "I didn't know that." He smiled faintly. "Most people don't ask." There was a long, comfortable silence between them as the orchestra resumed playing. It was the kind of silence that spoke more than words, the kind that carried understanding instead of distance. And in that quiet moment, amid all the wealth and vanity surrounding them, Clara realized that beneath Adrian's steel exterior, was a man who carried his past like a hidden scar, one shaped by loss and self-reliance rather than privilege. But the peace didn't last long. Across the table, Marcus's voice broke through the music. "Adrian, I must say your assistant handles herself impressively for someone so new to this kind of company." His smile was sharp as glass. "You might want to keep an eye on her." "I saw half the room trying to figure out who designed her gown." Adrian's eyes flicked toward him. "Why would that matter?" "Oh, you know how people are," Marcus said lightly. "Status, perception, the usual. You've built an image of perfection, my friend. You wouldn't want anyone thinking you've, what's the phrase, lowered your standards." For the first time that evening, Adrian's composure cracked just slightly. His tone when he replied was calm but cold enough to still the air. "Marcus, I've spent my life surrounded by people who think status defines worth. I'm starting to realize they're wrong." Clara's hand brushed against his under the table, a small, instinctive gesture of reassurance. He didn't look at her, but he felt the steadiness in that touch. It grounded him more than he cared to admit. Later, as the band shifted to a slower melody, couples began to drift onto the dance floor. The lights dimmed to a warm golden hue, and the scent of roses and perfume mingled in the air. Adrian stood, turning to Clara. "Would you dance with me?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," he smiled. Neither was coming here, apparently. "But here we are." She laughed softly, and for a moment her reserve melted. She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the dance floor. The music wrapped around them, slow and deliberate, the rhythm steady as their movements. Adrian wasn't the best dancer, but he moved with the same quiet confidence he carried in every part of his life. Clara followed easily, her steps graceful, her composure natural. Around them, whispers continued, speculations, judgments, envy, but they no longer seemed to matter. The world had shrunk to the circle of their movement, the brush of fabric against fabric, the faint exchange of breath between two people who had both forgotten what it meant to be seen beyond their titles. As they danced, Adrian looked at her, not as his assistant, not as an employee, but as someone who reminded him that humility and strength could coexist beautifully. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "I'm just being myself." "That's what makes you remarkable," he replied. The music faded and applause rippled through the room. When they returned to their table, Clara excused herself for a moment, stepping outside to catch her breath. The cold night air brushed against her skin, the city lights glittering below like fallen stars. Inside, Adrian remained seated, unaware that half the room was now whispering, not with mockery but with reluctant admiration. People had seen something that didn't fit their expectations. Authenticity. And authenticity, in a world of facades, was more powerful than beauty. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian found Clara again near the exit, standing by the grand staircase. "Ready to leave?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, it's been memorable," he smiled. "More than you know." They walked out together into the night, the sound of distant laughter and violins fading behind them. The valet brought the car around, and as they drove through the sleeping city, neither spoke for a long time. Silence filled the space between them again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, like two lives quietly aligning after years of parallel loneliness. Adrian glanced at her reflection in the window, the faint glow of the streetlights tracing her features, the calm confidence still in her eyes, and he realized something simple yet profound. He hadn't just brought his assistant to a ball. He had brought the one person who reminded him what it meant to feel human again. When the car stopped outside her apartment, Clara turned to him with a small, sincere smile. "Thank you for trusting me enough to bring me there." He met her gaze. "Thank you for reminding me what trust feels like." And as she stepped out into the quiet night, Adrian watched her go, the faintest warmth stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with romance yet, but everything to do with respect, gratitude, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected: change. The following Monday began not with the hum of productivity that usually filled Vale dynamics, but with whispers that fluttered through the corridors like secret drafts in an old mansion. The gala had come and gone, but its echo lingered. Every employee who had seen the photos online or heard the gossip from someone who had seemed to find a reason to pause when Clara walked by. Some stared in quiet admiration, Others exchanged glances steeped in envy or disbelief. The office, usually governed by schedules and spreadsheets, had become a theater of speculation. Clara, however, moved through it all with the same unflinching grace that had carried her through the ballroom. Her focus never wavered. Her heels clicked evenly against the polished floor, as if rhythm alone could drown out the noise. Yet beneath that calm surface she felt the sting of every whisper. Respect was a fragile thing in a world built on appearances, and she knew how quickly it could be rewritten by rumor. In his top-floor office, Adrian was well aware of the murmurs. The company's communications team had already briefed him that morning, delicately hinting that certain board members were concerned about optics. He had listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his fingers interlaced beneath his chin as the PR manager spoke with cautious diplomacy. When she finished, he simply said, "People who judge sincerity as scandal have never known integrity," and dismissed the meeting. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. Not at Clara, not even at the gossip, but at the realization that success had built him a kingdom of glass walls, where every act of authenticity was treated as rebellion. By midday, he called Clara into his office. The elevator doors opened with their usual soft chime, and she stepped inside, composed but wary. The sunlight spilling through the glass panels painted the room in sharp lines of gold and silver. Adrian stood by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his posture rigid with thought. When he turned, his eyes softened. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I owe you an apology." She frowned slightly, taken aback. "For what?" "For putting you in a position you didn't ask for. I knew that bringing you to the gala would draw attention, but I underestimated how small minds can make big noise." Her expression was calm, but her words carried quiet conviction. "You don't owe me an apology for other people's insecurities. If anything, I'm grateful. You showed me that sometimes the only way to challenge perceptions is to walk straight through them." He looked at her, truly looked, and for a moment he saw not his assistant, not his employee, but the rare kind of person who could carry dignity, even when surrounded by doubt. "Still," he said after a pause, "I want you to know that if this ever makes you uncomfortable, if the gossip becomes too much, you have my full support to transfer or take time away." She shook her head. "If I leave because of gossip, they win, and I refuse to live by other people's assumptions." That answer left him speechless. It was the same fierce composure he had admired at the gala, now wrapped in quiet defiance. He nodded slowly. "Then let them talk," he said. "In time, the truth will speak louder than their noise." Outside, however, the noise was growing. News outlets that specialized in business gossip began to pick up the story, turning what had been a private act of respect into public speculation. Headlines whispered of unusual companionship, of the mysterious woman beside the tech magnate, of a story behind the smile. Every article paired a photo of them dancing beneath the chandeliers with words designed to sell intrigue rather than truth. Adrian's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues offering unsolicited advice to manage the narrative. He ignored them all. There was nothing to manage because there had been nothing to hide. But the more he ignored, the louder the speculation grew. Clara, too, felt the weight of it. The once friendly exchanges in the break room grew cautious. Some co-workers smiled too politely, while others avoided her altogether. She tried to focus on her work, losing herself in reports and schedules, but even solitude carried its own heaviness. Late one evening, when the office had emptied and the city glowed beneath the tower, she sat at her desk staring at her reflection in the glass wall. Her face looked calm, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She wasn't angry at the rumors. She was saddened by how easily people distorted kindness into scandal. It was then that Adrian appeared at her doorway, his voice breaking the quiet. "You're still here." She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Just finishing the quarterly summaries." He stepped into the room, the dim light casting soft shadows on his face. "You shouldn't have to stay late cleaning up after other people's distractions." "I'd rather stay busy," she said honestly. "It helps me ignore the rest." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "I admire that. You've handled this better than most executives I know." Clara looked down at her papers, then back up at him. "You built this company by standing against expectations. I guess I learned from watching." For a moment, silence filled the room again. Comfortable, steady, familiar. Then Adrian walked closer, his tone more thoughtful than before. "Do you ever regret taking this job?" She blinked, surprised. "No, why would I?" "Because you deserve more than the way some people here treat you. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and yet people measure you by your proximity to me, not by your own merit. It's unfair." Her expression softened. "Life isn't always fair, Mr. Vale. But character isn't built in fairness, it's built in response to it. People can say what they want. They can judge, assume, speculate. But at the end of the day, I know who I am. That's enough for me." He held her gaze for a long moment, then smiled quietly. "You have more strength than half the leaders in this city." "Maybe," she said, her tone gentle. "But I also have rent to pay." He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that filled the quiet room. It startled her for a second. She had never heard him sound so human, so relaxed. It was the laugh of a man who had carried too much weight for too long, and had finally found someone who reminded him that life could still contain lightness. In the days that followed, Clara's resilience began to change the tone of the whispers. The more she remained calm, the more foolish the gossipers appeared. Colleagues who had once doubted her started to notice the dignity in her silence. Investors who had quietly questioned Adrian's decision began to admire his indifference to trivial judgment. The storm slowly began to fade, replaced by an uneasy respect that no one dared voice aloud. But even as peace returned, something deeper had begun to shift between Adrian and Clara, something unspoken yet undeniable. Adrian found himself noticing her not just as his assistant, but as a presence that steadied him. In meetings, her quiet insight often reframed discussions. In chaos, her organization brought calm, yet beyond her professionalism, it was her integrity that unsettled him. The kind of integrity that couldn't be bought, managed, or replicated. He began to realize that what had drawn him to invite her to the gala wasn't loneliness alone. It was the hunger for authenticity in a world of masks. One Friday afternoon, as the city shimmered under a rare streak of sunlight, Adrian asked her to join him for lunch at the Foundation's new outreach center, the very charity the gala had supported. "I'd like you to see what we helped build," he said. "The part of my work that never makes the news." They drove across town to a quiet neighborhood where a newly renovated brick building stood gleaming, with fresh paint and a bright blue banner that read, "Horizon Youth Learning Hub." Inside, classrooms were filled with laughter and energy, children sketching, learning coding, playing instruments. The walls were covered with colorful murals painted by local volunteers. Clara's eyes widened with quiet amazement as she took it all in. "I never realized how much your company contributed to this," she said softly. Adrian smiled faintly. "Most people don't, they only see the numbers. But this is the only part that ever made me feel like success had meaning." They spent the afternoon touring the facility, listening to teachers and volunteers speak about their progress. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a warmth that dissolved the tension of gossip and judgment. Here, nobody cared who she was to Adrian Vale. They cared about what she was doing there. When a little girl handed her a crayon drawing of the building and said, "This is our school," Clara felt something shift inside her, a realization that purpose was stronger than perception. As they left, Adrian paused by the car looking up at the afternoon sky. "You know," he said quietly, "the irony is that all those people at the gala thought they were judging status, when really they were judging sincerity. And sincerity will always outlast reputation." Clara smiled. "Then you have nothing to worry about." He looked at her, eyes thoughtful. "Neither do you." That evening, back in the solitude of his penthouse, Adrian stood once again before the towering windows that overlooked the city. But tonight the skyline looked different, less like a fortress of glass and more like a landscape of possibility. He thought of how easily one evening had exposed the fragility of the life he had built, and how one woman's quiet courage had reminded him what true strength looked like. Below, the city lights blinked like scattered stars, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt something beyond ambition, a sense of peace, fragile but real. He realized that the true price of perception wasn't paid in reputation, but in authenticity. And in a world that rewarded appearances, the rarest form of power was simply being genuine. The calm that followed the storm of gossip did not last. In business, stillness often meant only that the next wave was gathering strength somewhere out of sight. And Adrian Vale, who had built his empire on precision and control, could sense the tremor long before it reached him. It began innocently, as such things often do. A small discrepancy in the quarterly audit from one of the company's European divisions, a misplaced figure that should have meant nothing. But when Clara brought it to his attention, her instincts told her it was not a clerical error. She had spent enough nights reviewing contracts and invoices to recognize patterns, and what she saw in those numbers was the shadow of something deliberate. At first, Adrian dismissed it with the impatience of a man accustomed to solving larger problems. But later that evening, long after the office had emptied, he returned to her report and studied it again. The more he read, the more his certainty began to erode. Hidden beneath routine transactions was a trail of quiet manipulation. Funds siphoned through shell accounts, documents signed in haste, authorizations forged so elegantly that only someone intimately familiar with the company's structure could have caught them. By morning, the storm had a name: Marcus Gray. The same friend who had laughed at him during the gala, the man whose charm masked a predator's instinct, had been embezzling from one of Vale Dynamics' subsidiaries under the guise of a partnership deal. Adrian felt the betrayal like a physical blow. Their friendship had been strained for years, but he had still trusted Marcus enough to bring him into several ventures, convinced that their shared history outweighed ambition. Now that illusion had dissolved, and with it, the last remnants of Adrian's belief that loyalty could survive in a world ruled by profit. He spent the next 48 hours in relentless motion, meetings with legal teams, emergency calls with auditors, controlled damage assessments. Yet beneath the precision of his crisis management was something he had not felt in a long time: anger. Not the clean, strategic kind that fueled competition, but a deeper, rawer fury born from betrayal. Clara watched him quietly through those tense days. She had never seen him like this before, driven not by ambition but by vengeance. He hardly ate, barely slept, and his words carried an edge sharper than usual. The staff tiptoed around him, whispering their fears, but she refused to leave his side. She became the silent rhythm that steadied his chaos, arranging documents, filtering messages, reminding him of appointments he was too consumed to remember. And yet beneath her professionalism, she worried. Not for the company, but for the man. Success had always defined him, but now she wondered what would be left once he confronted the rot within his own circle. One night, when the city outside had faded into mist and the only light in the office came from the glow of computer screens, Clara entered his office carrying a folder. He was standing by the window again, shoulders tense, eyes dark with thought. "You need to go home," she said softly. "It's past midnight." He didn't turn. "Home is just another room with more silence," he said. "At least here I can fight the noise." She hesitated, then placed the folder on his desk. "These are the finalized findings from the investigation. You were right. Marcus Gray signed off on the false contracts himself." Adrian finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Then it's over." "Not yet," she said quietly. "He's threatening to sue. He claims the documents were forged by your staff to sabotage him. He's already leaking statements to the media." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Of course he is. That's how men like him survive, by burying the truth under louder lies." He walked toward the desk, flipping open the folder, his eyes scanning the evidence. "We'll fight it. We'll go public if we have to." Clara watched him in silence for a moment before speaking again. "Adrian, listen to me. You need to be careful. The board is nervous. They're afraid this could damage the company's image." "I built this company," he snapped, the frustration in his voice barely contained. "Every inch of it came from my work, not theirs. If they think they can lecture me about image, they can find another job to polish their reputations." She didn't flinch at his tone, only stepped closer. "You're angry, and you have every right to be. But don't let this turn you into the same kind of man you despise." Her words hung in the air, quiet but unyielding. Adrian exhaled, the tension in his shoulders softening just slightly. "You think I'm losing myself?" "I think you're in danger of forgetting why you started all this," she said. "You built something that mattered, something that gave people work and purpose. Don't let Marcus steal more than money. Don't let him steal your integrity." The silence that followed was heavy but cleansing. For the first time in days, Adrian sat down, burying his face in his hands. Clara remained still, giving him space until finally he spoke. "You know, he said, his voice quieter now. When my father died, I promised myself I'd never let anyone make me feel powerless again. That's why I built all this. Not for the money, not for the power, but because control felt like safety. But sometimes I wonder if that promise has turned me into a man who only knows how to fight. Clara stepped closer, her tone steady and gentle. Fighting isn't the problem, Adrian. It's what you're fighting for that defines you. Her words struck something deep within him. He looked up at her, and in that gaze, the exhaustion and the anger began to fade, replaced by something more fragile. Trust. I don't know what I'd do without you, Clara, he admitted quietly. You'd manage, she said with a small smile. You always do, but maybe it's time to learn you don't have to do it alone. The next morning, Adrian made his decision. He called an emergency board meeting and laid out every piece of evidence, every document, every falsified signature, every trace of Marcus Gray's deceit. Some directors urged him to settle privately to avoid scandal, but he refused. We tell the truth, he said simply. If transparency costs us profit, so be it. At least we'll be able to look at ourselves without shame. The room fell silent. There was something in his tone, a quiet conviction that reminded even the most jaded investors why they had once followed him. Clara sat in the back watching him speak and felt an unfamiliar swell of pride. The man who had once measured success in numbers was now measuring it in principles. News broke the next day. Headlines that once speculated about gala gossip were now filled with words like integrity, accountability, and courage. Adrian Vale had exposed corruption within his own ranks, sacrificing convenience for honesty. The market wavered briefly, as it always does when truth disturbs comfort, but within days the company's reputation rebounded stronger than before. What surprised everyone was not just his leadership. It was the quiet, unwavering woman who had stood beside him throughout it all. Several journalists tried to paint Clara as the mysterious confidant who had guided him, but she declined every interview. It wasn't about guidance, she told one reporter politely. It was about doing what's right. Weeks later, when the crisis had settled and Marcus Gray's name had vanished from headlines, Adrian invited Clara to his home for dinner, a gesture not of formality but of gratitude. His penthouse, usually immaculate and cold, felt warmer that evening. The scent of cedar and rain drifted through the open balcony doors, and for once the city noise below seemed distant. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the unspoken familiarity between them soft but steady. Then Adrian said, You know, I've been thinking about what you said. That fighting isn't the problem, it's what you're fighting for. I think I finally understand it. Clara looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. And what are you fighting for now? He smiled faintly, not the polished smile of a CEO, but the genuine one of a man finally beginning to understand himself. For the kind of life that doesn't need defending. For something real. She returned the smile, quiet but knowing. Then maybe this is the first time you've truly won. They sat for a long while after that, the city's golden light spilling into the room. Neither spoke of the gala, or the rumors or the headlines that had once tried to define them. Those things felt small now, shadows of a past already fading. What remained was something quieter, stronger, and infinitely more enduring. Respect built through fire, trust tested by adversity, and an unspoken connection that both of them knew would shape everything that came next. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the glass, soft and rhythmic. Adrian turned his gaze toward the skyline that had once represented isolation, now painted in hues of renewal. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what lay ahead or what might be lost. He was simply present in the stillness, in the company of the one person who had reminded him that humanity, once rediscovered, could never again be forgotten. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a softness that San Francisco hadn't known in months. The city that once seemed made of glass and tension now shimmered under warmer skies, its fog replaced by clear light and the scent of the sea drifting inland. For the first time in a long while, Adrian Vale felt that same lightness in himself. The company had survived the crisis, stronger and cleaner than before, and though the world's attention had moved on to newer stories, the lessons it had left behind still echoed quietly through his days. Success, he realized, was no longer about the numbers on his quarterly report, or the accolades attached to his name. It was about the integrity that held him upright when everything else had threatened to fall. Yet beyond the professional restoration, there was something more personal, something that had taken root quietly and stubbornly, like a flower growing through concrete. It was the understanding that the walls he had built to protect himself had also been prisons, and the key had been standing beside him all along in the form of a woman who carried grace like a shield and kindness like fire. Clara Bennett's world had changed as well, though not in ways visible to the city around her. She still came to the office each morning with her usual calm efficiency, her files perfectly arranged, her schedule precise, her demeanor as composed as ever. But inside her, something had shifted. Working with Adrian through the storm had awakened a clarity she hadn't known she needed. She had spent years supporting someone else's vision, and though she took pride in her work, she began to wonder what her own dreams might look like if she allowed herself to chase them. Late at night, when she sat by her apartment window overlooking the quiet streets, she would catch herself sketching outlines of community programs, imagining spaces where young women could learn financial literacy, leadership, and self-confidence, the very skills that had carried her from obscurity to the top floors of one of the largest companies in the country. It was an idea that frightened her because it felt too bold, too personal, but it also filled her with the kind of excitement she hadn't felt since childhood. One morning, as sunlight poured through the tall glass panes of the tower, Clara arrived earlier than usual and found Adrian already there, sitting at his desk with a mug of coffee untouched beside him. The exhaustion that had haunted his features for years seemed to have lifted, replaced by quiet focus. When he looked up, the faint smile that crossed his face held gratitude rather than authority. "You're early," he said. "Habit," she replied, setting her folder on the desk. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit for a moment. There's something I want to discuss with you." She sat, curious, folding her hands neatly on her lap. Adrian leaned back, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "The foundation has offered me a seat on their advisory board," he said. "They want to expand the Horizon Learning Hub into a national initiative. They need someone to help coordinate with local organizations, to oversee outreach and structure. I told them I had the perfect person in mind." Clara blinked, taken aback. "You're not serious," she said. "I'm not a foundation executive, Adrian. I manage logistics, not national programs." He smiled faintly. "You manage people. You build systems that actually work, and you care enough to make those systems mean something. That's exactly what they need." Her first instinct was to refuse. Comfort whispered to her to stay where she was safe, where she was certain. But another voice, the one she had been trying to ignore for weeks, rose within her. What if this was the door she had been waiting for? What if all the nights she had spent wondering, what if were leading to this? She met his gaze, her composure faltering just slightly. "If I accept," she said quietly, "I'd have to leave the company." He nodded, his expression unreadable but kind. "I know." Silence stretched between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara said, "When I first came here, I thought my goal was to serve something greater than myself. But maybe serving means building something of my own too." "That's exactly why you should do it," Adrian said. "Because you're not running from this place, you're growing beyond it." The decision, though heavy, felt right. Over the next few weeks, preparations began quietly. Clara worked with the Foundation's directors to outline the program's structure, setting deadlines, creating networks, and drafting proposals. Adrian watched from a respectful distance, helping where she allowed but never interfering. He knew that part of growth was learning to let go, and though the thought of her absence left a hollow ache, he also understood that true respect meant not holding on to someone whose path was calling them forward. On Clara's final day at Vale Dynamics, the office was unusually quiet. The staff, who had once whispered rumors behind her back, now looked at her with genuine admiration. Even the most cynical executives found excuses to stop by her desk to thank her. When she finally stepped into Adrian's office one last time, the sunlight slanted through the blinds in long golden lines, dust motes swirling like slow confetti. He was standing by the window again, the same place where their story had begun. "So," he said softly, "this is it." She smiled, calm but wistful. "It feels strange to leave something that's been my whole world for years." "Strange is good," he replied. "It means you're alive." She laughed quietly, then grew serious. "You know, when you asked me to the gala, I thought it was a mistake. I thought I didn't belong in your world. But it turns out belonging has nothing to do with circles or invitations. It's about standing where you're meant to stand, even if no one expects you to. He looked at her, pride and warmth blending in his gaze. You taught me that too. For a moment they simply stood there, the weight of shared history settling between them. Then Adrian reached into his desk drawer and took out a small box wrapped in gray paper. A parting gift, he said, handing it to her. She hesitated before opening it, and when she did, she found a silver pen, elegant, understated, engraved with the words, "Write the next chapter." Her throat tightened as she traced the inscription. Adrian, He raised a hand gently. No speeches. Just promise me one thing. What's that? That you'll never stop fighting for what's real. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I promise. They walked together to the elevator. The doors opened with a familiar chime, and as she stepped inside, she turned back one last time. Thank you, she said. For what? For believing in me before I believed in myself. The doors closed, and for a long while Adrian stood in the empty hallway, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade into the hum of the city below. He felt no sadness, only a quiet fullness, the kind that comes when something ends exactly as it should. Months later, the Horizon Learning Initiative launched in 3 cities simultaneously. Photographs filled the newspapers. Clara Bennett standing before rows of young women holding books and laptops, her smile radiant yet grounded. She spoke at conferences about equality and education, about the importance of integrity and leadership, and though her name was beginning to gain recognition, she never sought fame. She still signed every letter with the same pen Adrian had given her, a small reminder of where she had begun. As for Adrian, he continued to lead Veil Dynamics, but something fundamental had changed. The empire he once ruled like a fortress became an organism built on empathy and trust. He instituted mentorship programs, invested in local startups, and spent more time at the Horizon Centers than in boardrooms. The man who had once been defined by isolation had learned to live among people again. He even found himself laughing more, genuine laughter that reached his eyes, and sometimes when he stood at the edge of a crowded event, he would catch glimpses of himself in the reflections of others. Not the lonely millionaire the world once gossiped about, but a man who had been humbled and remade by truth. One crisp autumn evening, a gala was held to celebrate the success of the Horizon expansion. It had been nearly a year since the night that had changed everything. The ballroom glittered again, familiar and new at once. This time Adrian walked in alone, but not lonely. When he reached the stage to speak, the crowd fell silent. A year ago, he began, I learned that perception can crumble in a moment, but character endures for a lifetime. Tonight isn't about me or any single person. It's about what happens when we stop pretending and start believing in something real. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the audience, where Clara stood near the back smiling quietly. And it's about the courage of those who remind us that dignity doesn't need approval to exist. Applause filled the hall, long and sincere. Later, as the crowd dispersed and music drifted through the air, Adrian approached Clara. They hadn't seen each other in months, yet conversation came easily, like no time had passed at all. So, he said, smiling, how does it feel to build something that changes lives? She laughed softly. Exhausting, beautiful, worth it. Everything good usually is, he said. They walked together through the quiet corridor, the golden chandeliers reflecting off marble floors. For a moment it felt like the past had circled back, not to repeat itself but to show how far they had come. When they reached the doors, Clara turned to him. You look happier, she said. I am, he replied, because I finally understand what success means. And what's that? He looked toward the night sky beyond the glass where the city lights shimmered like constellations scattered by human hands. Success, he said softly, isn't about how high you climb. It's about who you become on the way up, and who you have the courage to bring with you. They stood there for a moment longer, 2 lives forever linked by a single act of courage. A gala invitation that had begun as a simple gesture and ended as a story of transformation. When they finally said goodbye again, it wasn't with sadness, but with quiet certainty. The lonely millionaire had found peace, and the assistant who once doubted her place in his world had discovered her own. As Adrian stepped into the night, the wind carried the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom behind him. He looked up at the skyline, his skyline, and for the first time in years it didn't feel cold. It felt alive, human, and infinite. Somewhere within that vast city, he knew, were people like Clara Bennett. People who still believed that kindness could rebuild what ambition had broken. And for a man who had once measured life in numbers, that belief was the richest fortune he would ever own.